Because of their internal politics, I ended up basically being the lamb that was sent for the slaughter. And that really affected my career. I couldn't be seen to be a failure. And I didn't want my children and my family to have that. So my mindset is I needed to keep going. And it was easier to transition into criminality. They took all the risk, they did what they did, and I basically got commissions. But I don't think companies do enough to actually prevent insider threat. They know it goes on and they don't want to admit that it goes on, because the reputation or damage of admitting that it's happened against them is actually sometimes worse than the actual financial loss itself. And when you know that, you can exploit that and use that to your own advantage. And I think that's the kind of issue, I could have exploited them very, very heavily if I chose to do it.
Welcome to this week's Cognitas Global podcast. With me today, I have a gentleman called Scott Kidd. Now, Scott has a very diverse background, ranging from a particular thing that I know he's going to talk to you about in great depth, through to diverse criminology, psychology, and a finance background. He's currently studying for his PhD, having already obtained an MA in criminology, and he works with organisations such as the Howard League for Penal Reform, academia, and various organisations, including the police, to do with counter fraud and education in relation to criminality, really. Scott, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me today.
Can I ask you, what are you doing right now and where are you?
Well, I'm currently in my office at the University of Lincoln. I'm an associate lecturer and researcher, and I work in criminology and psychology within the university.
We first met in London earlier on this year, Scott, at a fraud conference. We hadn't met before. You were a guest speaker, and it particularly interested me because I think it's fair to say that at some stage we both operated on different sides of the fence. We'll come to that. Sure. We operate on the same side now. And I was particularly interested and really captivated by the talk and the interview that took place regarding your life, really. Some things that you had done, how you turned some of those issues around and what you're doing now. And that's really what I want to talk about today. Just give us an idea who Scott Kidd is. I mean, where were you born? Where were you raised? Where did you go to school, university?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I was actually born in Newcastle originally, so a born and bred Geordie. Had a very, very strong Geordie accent. It's fair to say that I probably didn't grow up in the nicest part of town. So, some of the roughest sort of council estates. Moved down to Leicester. I moved to an even worse council estate than I came from. So in terms of my sort of background, it was quite poor. Family life wasn't particularly great. My dad was an alcoholic, quite abusive with it. My mum had various nervous breakdown, one after the other. And I had a very sort of troubled school life, really, And I suppose, in terms of my journey, I kind of became very disillusioned in the system. And I felt like the system very much failed me. And pretty much all the way through my school sort of journey, because I'd been sort of that troubled kid that kind of acted out because of what was going on at home. I was basically, sort of punished it quite punitively. And in another sense, I was told I'd never be anything. I'd always be, a failure. I would never amount to anything. And I suppose that kind of gave me the appetite to kind of make sure that I elevated myself away from where I grew up from. So I ended up sort of landing myself roles, initially quite junior roles in banking. And quite quickly, they saw promise within me. And I think it was I entered banking at the time where it was the kind of you either sink or you swim. So they chucked people into much higher roles, and then they probably have the skill set for to see whether they'd actually, be successful or not. It's a bit like one of those sort of, the movies where they're kind of like, you have to spend all your money within that time frame, or everything's going to go, you're going to lose everything. And I think in that sort of sense of banking time, they'd put me in these really high profile roles. And I did very, very well from it.
Can I ask you, in terms of the bank you're working for, I mean, by all means, if you want to name them, name them. If not. I think everything's a matter of record. But it was a high street bank or another type of bank?
It was a high street bank initially. So I worked for Royal Bank of Scotland Group, and I worked with them Lombard North Central. So I dealt with them high value loans and lending between anything from 10 to £100 million plus. So I was dealing with them quite high profile customers, very much in that kind of spending big, company sort of credit cards and that kind of thing to entertain clients, bringing them in, and then basically, putting financial lending in place for all sorts of things, from recovery strategies to building dams. I kind of financed that. Without sort of getting into too much of the particulars, I even financed certain royals' personal car fleets. So it was that kind of sort of the high end client that I would end up dealing with.
So that's exposing you to high net worth clients, offshore banking, a much broader financial market than perhaps many people would be familiar with.
Yeah,
it's fair to say that your life took a particular turn for which you subsequently paid with a term of imprisonment. So let's just deal with that if we can, maybe just in stages. Clearly, you had a lot of power and influence, a high level of responsibility and decision-making authority in the bank and authorization to make huge loans. What went wrong? What happened?
Well, I basically created a new strategy within the bank to merge two parts of the organization together. And my boss at the time decided to pass the work off as his own. And because of that, he obviously received quite a lot of sort of internal kind of accolade and kind of like got put into a very, very senior position within the organization. They then realized that obviously he passed off my work. And because of that, they couldn't risk the reputational damage of him then losing that position for what he'd done. So I subsequently got put on gardening leave. So I got put onto gardening leave and kind of almost got pushed out of the city at the time, and finally got a job in BNP Paribas, which is a French bank, and looked at sort of Arval PHH sort of leasing solutions. And I basically saw that there was actually a hole within the leasing market. There was actually a missing product. And with my kind of knowledge of the system, basically created my own leasing company. And because I knew how high level lending worked, because I knew what the sort of the banking sort of strategies were, what they would be looking for, I fundamentally created everything I needed to get the loans and the lending to set my leasing company up and grow a company over the course of 18 months to a 5,000 car fleet from nothing, using the bank's money. So it was
and this is whilst you're employed for the bank?
Whilst I was employed, yes. I actually set it up in my father's name because I was on a non-compete clause. So I set that kind of all up running alongside, and then eventually sort of then migrated away from obviously working and then into the company once it was more established.
So I'm assuming what you were doing was against all rules in the bank at that time, or not?
It was, in terms of I wasn't allowed to obviously get lending from Royal Bank of Scotland Group or any of the associated partners because I had a unique insight, but because it wasn't going through my name, they didn't technically know about it. And I amassed, large sort of credit facilities and banking facilities, etc., in order to actually, support the company to grow.
And look, we're not going to glamorize any aspects of this. I mean, I think the story that takes you offshore and to various places and all sorts of assets and that. And clearly there were some parties that suffered financially in this.
Yes.
But in context of what we're going to be talking about generally, and that's insider threat and fraud, you became the classic insider threat, I guess, because of that incident in Royal Bank of Scotland. Your motivation was, I guess, well, you tell me how you felt, because this is critical for people to understand, about the insider threat.
Yeah. Well, the knowledge I had, I could have gone through any other funding partner. I could have gone to, Halifax Bank of Scotland, which I ended up going through at the end of it, and various other people. Sort of to really boil it down, I felt like sort of Royal Bank of Scotland in a sense had failed me because I had a really successful career with them. And because of their internal politics, I ended up basically being the lamb that was sent for the slaughter. And that really affected my career. So my motivation when I had this sort of, the opportunity to get lending was I thought, well, instead of going to another provider, I want them to fund my business. I want them to be the ones that actually help me make a success of myself because of what they'd done to me. I suppose you could say it was kind of like a form of revenge in some ways. So yes, that's the kind of sort of mindset that I was in when I decided to go for them and for the lending, really.
So there was no criminality per se at Royal Bank of Scotland.
No,
I assume. you've set up the company in your father's name at BNP Paribas, and you're starting to leverage a lot of lending from Royal Bank of Scotland.
Yeah.
When did it cross the line into criminality at that stage? And look, we're not trying to glamorize any of this.
Yeah.
We're going to come on to how you paid and how you turned all this around. But what happened? When did it become criminal?
Well, basically what happened was we were actually doing really well. We were buying a lot of vehicles, 200-300 vehicles at a time. And we were rapidly growing as a company. And then the residual value market fell out of used vehicles. So when that happened, our asset book basically lost millions of pounds pretty much overnight. Lex Vehicle Leasing went bust at the time. And in a sense, because I'd been kind of told that I'd always be a failure, I couldn't allow that company to fail. And because the size of sort of transactions we were doing, we were on monthly VAT reclaims. And we'd already submitted a load of invoices for 200 vehicles. We cancelled the order because of what had happened to the residual values in the market. But the invoices had already been processed, and I received a very, very large VAT repayment for vehicles that I hadn't purchased. So in the initial sort of phase, it was like, okay, I'll borrow that money temporarily just to keep the company going because I had employees and all those sorts of things, and I would pay it back. But then as we got to the sort of the next round, obviously we needed more funding because our losses were so sort of huge that I then decided at that point, okay, I'm going to submit a fake VAT reclaim, because I've got a load of these invoices. So I placed an order, cancelled it, had all the genuine invoices, put them through, and they got paid out on. But my intention initially was always to pay it back. But then it got to a point where it was so big and there'd been so much fraud that had gone through that there's no way I could pay it back. So I tried to then diversify into other sort of businesses and markets and set up, other companies to try and kind of like weather the storm, to try and sort of keep everything kind of going and ticking over. Unfortunately, you get to that kind of precipice where things are unsalvageable. So that kind of was the path I kind of went down. But then because I was involved with all these things, and because I grew up on a council estate, I knew a lot of people that were involved in organised crime, and they were friends of mine, but previously I hadn't been involved with any sort of criminality. And I started talking about what I was doing, and they were like, can you help us set these things up? And I think that's where it kind of spiraled and moved on, really, moving over to Marbella. And then when I was in Marbella, getting involved with a lot of other sort of organisations and a lot of other activities, just purely because the knowledge that I had, and people would come to like, how do I do this? And the knowledge I had was valuable. It was a commodity. And in a sense, it became a bit of a consultant to some people.
So if we were to summarise this then, what we're talking about is VAT fraud.
Yeah.
What was the total extent of the VAT fraud? If we were just to summarise that,
they could prove that I'd taken £1.4 million personally across an organisation. They did sort of intimate that it was £28 million, although they couldn't prove it. Then they dropped it to 8.5, but they couldn't prove it, and they basically settled on 1.4, which is where we kind of said, okay, that's the point where we can actually agree on in terms of sums of money.
And if I can ask you, at the first stage, it became. And where did the Royal Bank of Scotland feature in terms of their losses? Did they lose money out of this in the end?
Yes, they did, because I kind of realised that, that the knowledge I had for relationships meant I could exploit systems and operations and processes that existed. So I started to diversify a little bit away from fraud and then set up sort of more kind of large sort of scale confidence scams. So, for example, I would set up a new company, get a set of financials, put them through to, let's say, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and manipulate the relationship with PricewaterhouseCoopers to actually almost endorse these set of projected financials, although almost as if they were real. And because I knew what the process would be for the actual process, I ended up getting them confirming that these financials were being prepared by them, and people took that as an audited position. So then I could then go to a bank and say, right, I need £1 million overdraft, and they'd give me one on the basis of these projections. Because everyone bought into the brand of PwC, I knew the process with PwC because of how their relationships worked. So I had that kind of knowledge from how I from the banking side of things that I was then able to exploit as well. So it kind of, it was sort of lots of different things that kind of sort of all interplayed that allowed me to do what I did.
And if I can ask you again, coming back to this sort of insider threat. So, initially we see that we understand the motivation against RBS. You're then in a situation where it's almost, I'm assuming when you were running the business, there was no, in essence, criminality around the way that you ran the leasing business. Would that be correct?
No, none at all. Not to start with. It was only when the business started to fail.
So then you're robbing Peter to pay Paul by setting up all these different companies. And there comes a stage when you realize that you're just not going to recover the situation.
Absolutely.
When did that situation go from you trying to save a business by whatever means it was you doing, and I would imagine that was bleeding into areas of criminality and fraud. Yeah. When did it come to you moving right across to, full on fraud or other crime, financial related crime, and why did that transition take place? Why did you just not stop, accept the losses? Why did you feel that you needed to move on to that other side, the darker side?
It becomes more sort of psychological, to be honest with you. I couldn't be seen to be a failure. I had to kind of maintain this image that I was doing well. And I think that kind of came from a lot of things, obviously from my childhood, from school, growing up the way I did. And I didn't want my children and my family to have that. I didn't want them to be exposed to what I've been exposed to in terms of financial hardships, to abuse and all those sorts of things. So my kind of sort of mindset is I needed to keep going and I needed to, have achieved that. And when the businesses went, that formal structure went. So I then had to apply my knowledge to still have that lifestyle and earn that level of money in order to feel that I was able to actually not allow my family to sort of grow up where I grew up in a sense, or experience what I experienced. So it became at that point more of a survival, and it was easier to transition into criminality because they paid well. It was very quick. They took all the risk. They did what they did. And I basically got commissions. And a commission could be the fact that, the keys get dropped off for a £1 million yacht, for argument's sake. And that would turn up in the port with my name on the papers. And that's what they kind of did. And that's the kind of the process that it went through. I would like to say that I have no yachts anymore. I live a very kind of modest lifestyle these days.
Well, we'll come to that, and there will be people that will listen to this with different views. But it's important that the whole podcast is listened to, so that people can form an overall view of I guess your journey. One question: what is it that prevented the banks from identifying what was going on at this time? You'd found gaps in the system, you're exploiting those gaps. What was it within the organization that didn't enable them to properly deal with that insider threat, or what was going on? In general terms, I don't want to criticize the individual fraud departments within banks, but just generally.
Because when you're actually sort of dealing with the wealth side of things, when you're in wealth banking, corporate banking, and all those sorts of things, which is what my organizations were set up to be, you're dealing with that personal relationship, and your gatekeeper, that person who sort of manages that relationship, also earns commissions, also earns status within their role from the success that they have with their clients. And when you know that, and then you know what they're governed by and what they need to achieve and all the rest of it, you can exploit that and use that to your own advantage. And I think that's the kind of issue. When you've got wealth, you expect a certain level of service. And if you don't get that service, you'll go to someone who'll give you that service. But with that service comes a bit of a trade-off in terms of, if you're there to exploit, then you can exploit with that knowledge.
Yeah, and that's a perpetual weakness in all anti-money laundering systems and regulated sector, isn't it, really, right across, when you look at corruption and lawyers and facilitators and enablers and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Let's talk about where it ended up for you, what it cost you, what penalties are involved. So you get captured. Where was the downfall? What come to the end of your run? How did you get captured?
Well, it all kind of started to unfold. Someone that worked for my organization started to try and set their own thing up, and they got caught. And when they got caught, they basically said to the police, you don't want to be looking at me, you want to be looking at Scott. They went Queen's evidence against me. I was actually overseas at this point, so they didn't come over to find me. But when I came back into the UK, they arrested me for a minor charge. And that charge obviously then ran. I got a small sentence at that point of 13 months. But what that did is it gave me bad character. And the day that actual sentence expired, they then served me with the big case. And I was looking at between 9 to 12 years for that. I was on bail. I got a notification from a friend I had in the police that they were going to rescind my bail. So I decided to go on a 2-year holiday over to Northern Cyprus. And it got to the point where I just couldn't keep doing it anymore because, I just sort of had remarried at this point. I had a young son, and it just wasn't, a life on the run, in Northern Cyprus is not the best way. They had me under surveillance whilst I was in Northern Cyprus the whole time. But they couldn't do anything because there's no powers there because, Northern Cyprus is an annexed country, it's annexed from Turkey. So technically it doesn't exist.
Well, it's interesting you say that, if I could may interrupt. When was it that you were over there? And I think I've mentioned this to you previously.
Yes, I was over there in 2011.
Yeah. Ironically, I was working in Northern Cyprus for 2 years on behalf of the EU on a freedom of movement of capital project, which essentially was helping them build up their anti-money laundering regime. So whilst I was over there doing that, you're in fact running around, being followed around by people that, and what they were doing in relation to you was certainly not within my remit or purview. I was there as a consultant helping them on a sort of policy level and training level. So you come back, you get captured. Tactically, you could argue they play a blinder in terms of the timing of what happened to you. And perhaps some people would say no less than you deserve, of course.
Well, I totally agree with that. I did what I did.
Sure. But then, so what were the final charges and the sentence that you ended up and when you got that, Scott?
In total, with everything all done and dusted, I was basically given 11 and a half years with my guilty discount taken off. So you could say that was close to 18 to 19 years. And I ended up serving 5.5 years in custody of that in total.
And I assume there was a confiscation order in relation to your assets as well.
Yeah, there was indeed. Yeah. So that's all been sort of done and settled and everything's gone. So basically,
and how much, if I can ask, how much was the confiscation order made against you? That's a determination of value of your assets and then and your benefit from crime. And then there is obviously a calculation as to how much is taken away in terms of the assets that you do have remaining. What was that in the end? If I
and all in all, 28 million was taken from me, and I was left. I still have 100,000 that's outstanding.
So you're left with nothing. You're in prison. At that stage, you've got a family. You mentioned a family.
Absolutely, yes.
Just what was the family situation then?
We ended up losing the house, lost all our cars. We lost pretty much everything that we had. And, businesses at that point as well, which, we'd restarted up and all sorts of things. So pretty much everything we had was gone. So my wife had to basically start up again. I wanted to move away from, any sort of form of connections that I had. So we moved from Leicester, where we ended up being based at that point, when I came back, to moving to Lincolnshire, which is where we currently reside now.
And what turned it around? You're in prison for 5.5 years, plenty of time to think, which you clearly did because you decided then to take a path during that time. But perhaps you could just describe that process for me.
Well, I actually trained to become a psychotherapist, and I did an advanced counselling and psychotherapy course. And part of my actual sort of reflective learning is I actually kind of ended up counselling myself and ended up dealing with all my historic trauma from my past and looked at things very rationally, as opposed to kind of taking that irrational viewpoint that I had taken previously. I rationalized things. And I saw obviously the impacts and harms it had on my family as well, my wife, my son, and my two older boys from my ex-wife, they really had a massive impact on everybody that was connected to me. And I think the time that they did was harder. So taking that into consideration on one hand, but then taking into consideration that I actually dealt with the reasons why I offended. And I often think, why don't, when you're actually in custody, why don't they actually do this work? Because in that 5.5 years, there was no restorative justice. There was no rehabilitation. It was just basically warehousing exercise. So in that sense of the world, I actually ended up carrying out my own rehabilitation by trying to actually sort of find a new path and find a new route away from sort of criminality. And then that kind of when I was released, I had a completely different viewpoint on life and a different direction of where I wanted to go. I saw a lot of the inequalities that existed within the system. I saw a lot of the failings on both sides, in terms of how prisoners are staffed, but then how the system fails prison staff as well. And I think that's the thing to take into consideration. It's not about, that poor prisoner. It's actually the poor people that are actually in that, whether you're on one side of the fence or the other side of the fence. And I think it's about kind of like acknowledging that as well. And from that, I decided to, sort of get myself the skills that I knew I would need in order to actually make the difference and make the change that I want to make. I want to tackle inequalities. I don't want children entering the justice system. I want to find more diversionary ways of things being dealt with. I want, for there to be equality for people so that they can have those opportunities so they can reintegrate into society. But ultimately, if I can actually stop people actually getting into custody and committing criminality, then that's where I'll actually sort of focus my research as well. So that's why I'm kind of involved in lots of different sort of projects and research specialities that kind of look to address different things.
Well, I think, if ever there's a case of rehabilitation, then certainly, it's fair to say that it truly applies to you. We met in an anti-fraud environment at that conference, but I know you do a lot of work with not just the prison penal reform groups, but also the police and around fraud stuff and youngsters. So perhaps you can just give the listeners a flavour for some of the stuff that you've been doing and how you've been working to try and assist police and other organisations.
Yeah, I work with I've worked with Lincolnshire Police's sort of education department, so how they sort of educate young people get away from things like knife crime and those sorts of things. I've looked at a problem in one of our coastal towns in terms of the high levels of public violence that exists and what are the causal factors of that. And I've actually done it from a practitioner's point of view. So I've actually interviewed youth workers and police from all different types of roles, people that work in sort of drugs and all that kind of stuff and rehabilitation, and actually looked at, to see what's causing those phenomenons. I work as well in terms of assessing things like the police's summertime policing strategy, see if that's worked. And there's a lot of sort of focus against things like violence against women in terms of new approaches that they've taken to reduce that. And then I also look at making higher education institutions inclusive. So my sort of PhD research is very much around how do you make sort of higher education institutions inclusive for people with criminal justice experience and that have got those criminal records, so they have the same opportunity to transform like the contemporary students. So a lot of my work is kind of split in lots of different areas, really, from accessibility, inclusion, and so people aren't discriminated against. But then I also look in terms of violence and how to reduce that and how to reduce criminality. On the fraud space, I kind of provide inside sort of knowledge in terms of how I exploited systems with various policing organizations. And if there's particular sort of complex cases that they don't necessarily understand, I'll actually work with them to actually explain what's going on from a professional point of view. And I think that's the important thing. What I've managed to sort of, there's always this kind of thing about the kind of like the them and us that exists, in terms of obviously from kind of people sort of who sort of manage sort of or deal with justice and the people that have actually offended. What I've tried to do with my work and what's sort of developed over time is this collaborative approach where I actually work alongside as a colleague to actually achieve the same goals. They've got their specialist knowledge in terms of investigation. I've got my specialist knowledge in terms of understanding what it actually is. And I think that's the biggest thing. With a lot of frauds, organizations don't necessarily know what the fraud is or how it's actually being done or how it's actually then being siphoned or moved around. But if you've actually worked in those circles, you know that, so you can actually become an asset and a tool to them.
And that really just brings me on to the last bit before we wrap this up. As you know, we do a lot of crisis management stuff. We do a lot of training in the criminal justice sector globally, training police officers, customs, prosecutors, judges, tax, all sorts of people. And people from the regulated sector as well, central banks. But we also do a lot of crisis management stuff where we incorporate insider threats, scenarios in relation to risk management and maps against crisis management plans. But I think what I see nowadays is with technology, digitalization, all the cybersecurity stuff, the insider threat potentially has could do a lot more damage than perhaps some of the activity that you were involved in previously. I mean, how do you view the whole thing now in terms of the corporate attitude towards, or the cultural change towards managing this or dealing with it or identifying it even?
In my sort of opinion, I don't think sort of companies do enough to actually prevent insider threat. And I think they kind of seem to operate in a state of denial. They know it goes on and they don't want to admit that it goes on. Yeah. And because of that, that allows individuals who are on that inside to do what they do and get away with it without the consequences necessarily that someone else in society would get from doing the same thing. Because for them, the reputational damage of admitting that it's happened against them is actually sometimes worse than the actual financial loss itself. And I think that if you were wanting to be savvy, especially in the positions that I was within the banking side of things, I could have exploited them very, very heavily if I chose to go to do it. And all the check processes and facilities that are in place, they're bypassed for certain people. They're bypassed for certain individuals who have got wealth. And because of that, I think it really exposes things massively. So yeah, I think companies are very much in denial, and I don't think they do anywhere near enough to address it. But then again, I think when you look at sort of the fraud market sort of globally, I don't think the government does enough to address it. I don't think the police do enough to address it when you look at what's actually invested in something which actually has the highest potential sort of risk currently to national security, but there doesn't seem to be the appetite to address it. And whether that be the fact that they don't have the knowledge or whatever, I don't know.
Well, I think a lot of victims of fraud nowadays will concur with that. But I do know personally people that are working within government to try and really change that around, and other organisations to really change that around. Resourcing is always a problem. Well, you'll know some of those organisations I'm talking about, but the will is there. But we've got to turn it around. There's no question about it. And also, to be fair, fraud on the international scene is not really recognised as fraud per se. For years, people have been fixated about money laundering, but really forgetting what just comes before that money laundering, and that's a predicate offence and offences of fraud. So that's something else that we're trying to tackle in work that we do. Scott, it's been a great pleasure to speak to you today. I know that it's been an unusual journey that you've been on. I congratulate you on the work that you're doing now. I hope people have listened to this and taken a view that there is the possibility and opportunity, and people do rehabilitate themselves. So thank you very much for your time. It's been really interesting for me, and thank you for perhaps educating some of our listeners that are unfamiliar with some of the issues that go on in a broader sense of what motivates people to commit crime. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for having me, Lawrie. Thank you.